to Spot Check, the weekly video update series for the greatest on reality, a dissertation about Dungeons & Dragons. I'm Nick Miser. I have returned from GaryCon and the frozen north of Wisconsin, and some of you are still up there in the cold, and my sympathies go out to you. It's quite nice in Texas these days. I'll be reflecting on my experiences at GaryCon over the next few weeks here in the videos, but I will say just it's always great to be back at GaryCon. It's sort of a family reunion is the feel that everyone tends to describe at that convention. And for me personally, it was where I first started my graduate fieldwork on D&D. It was my first GaryCon. And so now, having gone to the last GaryCon of my graduate fieldwork, it kind of has a nice full circle feel to it. So, but this week, we're going to be talking about kind of following up from last week's discussion where I discussed the difference between Dungeon Master as strategist and tactician, thinking about the power dimensions there, drawing on Dace or Toe's distinctions. And there's some ways that I think that maps up to or connects with some other distinctions that anthropologists have made, and that's looking at different types of religious specialists that exist in various cultures. Now, I should preface this by saying that I'm not trying to argue that role-playing games are a religious activity in the strict sense of the term, but I do find some interesting connections there, and because my starting point in looking into games was their relationship to both myth and ritual, it's something that I come back to a lot. And so the general similarity in the background for what I'm about to discuss is this idea that in both religion and spirituality, more general and mystic experiences, there's this idea of communicating or having contact with something that is other, something that's outside our reality. And that's where I find some of the parallels to what goes on in gaming, is this idea that we've talked about in the past of having contact with other realities, those being the worlds of our gaming environments, the fictive worlds that we explore through our gaming, whether that's Tecumel or Forgotten Realms or alternate versions of our reality in some sort of modern style game. So there's a sense in which we're connecting with other realities when we game, and we don't give those other realities usually the same sort of status as real that people tend to when you're dealing in religious or spiritual terms, but there are some parallels there. And so I want to draw on some of the terminology that we've developed as anthropologists and think about some of the ways that the dungeon master can interact with that other world in ways that are parallel in some ways to how religious specialists interact with other worlds as well. So one of the big distinctions in religious specializations that anthropologists have argued, and I'm drawing on primarily on a kind of a summary article that Victor Turner wrote here, is the distinction between priests, prophets, and shamans. And you can slice that all kinds of different ways, and those category distinctions are in some ways not entirely satisfactory, but they give us a starting point. Now, the thing that we'll look at is primarily between the priest on one side and the prophet and shaman on the other hand, and what I'm looking at here. Now, the priest is a religious specialist whose claim to religious authority derives primarily from their service in a sacred tradition, whereas the authority of the prophet or the shaman tends to be based on revelation, personal charisma, and experience. Or to look at it another way, the priest's power is inherited or derived from a body of codified and standardized ritual knowledge that they learn from older priests and later transmit to their successors. Whereas the shaman is also often initiated, but it's a much more personalized sort of tactical, to draw on our term from last week, sort of knowledge that's more on the ground and improvisational. The priest often communicates with transhuman entities through rituals that involve cultural objects and activities. The medium, shaman, and prophet communicate in a person-to-person manner in most cases. So let's look at those in terms of gaming. As I said, the priest's power is inherited from a derived body of codified and standardized ritual knowledge, learn from older priests and transmit it to successors. I'm holding up, obviously, the Dungeon Master's Guide here, which is a way of approaching dungeon mastering that I think strongly matches sort of a priestly understanding of that role. There's a codified and standardized body of ritual knowledge, and often those are tied in with more textual traditions. So that's not always the case, but it's the case here in that the Dungeon Master's Guide serves as this sort of tome of standardized ritual knowledge that allows people to interact with game worlds. And I think that also maps onto the idea of Dungeon Master as strategist in certain ways. It pulls the Dungeon Master a little bit more removed from the table and gives them the sort of authority that's derived from their position as Dungeon Master more than it is through individual charisma. Now, the other thing, a priest communicates with transhuman entities through ritual that involves cultural objects and activities, rolling dice. So there's a certain sense in which the priest the dungeon master in rolling dice is using cultural objects that have been imbued with a lot of divinatory power when we think of them in those terms of giving us insight into things that are happening in an alternate reality. But a dungeon master isn't just a priest offering access to this other world. I think that some dungeon masters are also tend towards more kind of a shamanic sort of role, and that's the dungeon master who's drawing and relying heavily on personal inspiration to interact with that other world, that fictive world. And it's not to say that everyone has to be one or the other, that these are hard and fast categories, and even in spiritual and religious specialization, these can be combined into a single person, but we've kind of teased out some of those roles and looking at different ways that people interact with other realities. And so on the shamanic side, we have that improvisational in some ways parallel to what's often described in shamanism as sort of being possessed or closely controlled by a spirit who serves as a means of communication between other human beings in the spirit world. And so when a dungeon master is acting very much in character and sort of quote-unquote being possessed or controlled by that persona that they're trying to embody, they're serving in their own body as a conduit between this world and another world. And I know that may sound kind of crazy and mystic to some of you who want to think of your gaming in more mundane terms, but I think that there are some real parallels here. And one of the ways that that has come out in my fieldwork so far is in talking with Liz back in Denton, Texas. There was a line in one of the game sessions when Liz was explaining to one of the new players who had never played an old school role-playing game before, her role as the dungeon master. And she said the words, "I am the asteroid." The game was set on an asteroid. But this idea that the dungeon master embodies the entire alternate world, and the world itself is part of who the dungeon master is. Whereas the players are individual people, the dungeon master is often described as the rest of the world and playing that role. So taking that line between body and cosmos as sort of a flexible thing, and granted we're dealing with sort of fictive realities that we deal with lightly, but there's still a lot of crossover there, and I think that's something that's really worth thinking about. The last thing I'll add into this before I leave you for next week is the idea that one of the things I see in geek culture more generally, and I've talked about in the past, is that a geek tends to be someone who is both a consumer and a producer of the things that they're enthusiastic about. They both watch Star Trek and write fan fiction, for example. And I think that you can see some interesting parallels there in gaming between thinking of the Dungeon Master as embodying this world that the players are both consuming and producing at the same time, producing in that the world comes into focus through their interactions with the dungeon master, and that space between them is taking shape as everyone at the table is both consuming everyone else's imaginative input and inputting their own, and kind of creating this thing that's bigger than any of them. And I think that's one of the things that really excites me a lot about gaming. I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. Like I said, for some of you, this may be the wackiest thing I've ever said, and you're never going to watch a video again. For others, I may be just on the tip of really getting to the important stuff. So I'd like to hear from you all, and I will talk to you next time.